Okay, we might make a start. Hi, my name's Anita Coles. I'm the Committee Secretary to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights in the Department of the Senate. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Canberra area, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I would also like to extend my respects to all Aboriginal and all Torres Strait Islander persons in attendance today. Thank you for attending today's lecture to mark the 10th anniversary of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. I warmly welcome you all, whether you're attending in person or online. Today's lecture has been live streamed on the Australian Parliament House website. It's also being Auslan interpreted and captioned. If time permits, the lecture will be followed by a short Q&A session. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's three panellists and moderator. First, we're joined by Mr. Harry Jenkins AO, who was the inaugural chair of the committee. Mr. Jenkins was the Labor member for Scullin in Victoria for 27 years, from 1986 to 2013, and served as the 26th Speaker of the House of Representatives. Secondly, we have the Hon Ken Wyatt AM, who was the inaugural Deputy Chair of the committee. Mr. Wyatt was the Liberal member for Hasluck in WA for 12 years, from 2010 to 2022, and was the first Indigenous member of the House of Representatives. Mr. Wyatt's held several ministerial appointments, including most recently serving as Minister for Indigenous Australians. And our third panellist is Mr. Graham Perrett MP, who's been the member for Moreton in Queensland for the past 15 years. Mr. Perrett was the Deputy Chair of the committee in the last two parliaments and is a current member of the committee and is its longest serving member. Finally, moderating today's discussion is Dr. Jacqueline Mowbry. Dr. Mowbry is an Associate Professor at the University of Sydney and has been the committee's external legal advisor since 2018. She has extensive research and teaching experience in international law and human rights. Would you please join me in welcoming the panellists?
Thank you very much, Anita, and welcome everyone to today's public lecture, Reflections of the 10th Anniversary of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. So before we start with our panel discussion, I'd just like to give a brief overview of the committee, which is possibly unnecessary for a lot of you in the audience. But I should say a lot of the comments that I'll be making today are drawn from the paper accompanying this lecture, which is available for download online. And I'll also be cheating a bit and using some other people's words and showing you a video as well shortly. So the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights was established in 2012 in order to enhance understanding of and respect for human rights in Australia. And its role has been to develop appropriate recognition of human rights in Australia and human rights issues in legislative and policy development. And it's also established a dialogue between the executive and Parliament and the public on human rights scrutiny concerns. So now, 10 years on, it's timely to assess the committee's work and reflect on the work that it's done scrutinising federal legislation and consider its impact on Parliament's consideration of legislation, and also how it has advanced and contributed to an awareness of human rights during legislative development. So what does the committee do? The committee scrutinises every bill and every legislative instrument for compliance with international human rights law. So as you'd expect, its output over 10 years has been considerable. So in the past 10 years, the committee has tabled 124 scrutiny reports, 8 annual reports and 8 inquiry reports. It's considered a total of 2,254 bills and commented on 602, or that's about 27% overall. It's examined over 18,000 legislative instruments, commenting on 466, an average of 3% overall. So the committee seeks to table its advice while bills are still before Parliament and while legislative instruments are still within their disallowance period. And since 2016, the committee has consistently reported on over 90% of bills while they've still been before the Parliament. And in the last 2 years, the committee has reported on 100% of legislative instruments within their disallowance period. Now, as the paper accompanying today's lecture sets out, it can be difficult to assess the full impact that the committee has had in relation to human rights in Australia and in relation particularly to legislation. While certainly there are some instances where legislation has been changed as a direct response to the committee's comments, in a lot of cases the committee's influence is felt more behind the scenes or as part of a broader process where the committee's comments and views are picked up and put forward by other people as part of that legislative process. So we hope that some of the case studies set out in the accompanying paper will be useful in highlighting some of that background impact and giving some more evidence on which to assess the full impact of the committee. So before we progress to our panel discussion, I'd now like to invite you all to watch a short video on the work of the committee. And featured in this video is comments by past and present chairs, deputy chairs, select members of the committee, legal advisors and academics who've been asked to give their reflection on 10 years of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights.
The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights was established in 2012. Its main function is to examine all bills and legislative instruments for compatibility with human rights and to report to both Houses of Parliament on its findings.
The changes in the framework are aimed at enhancing understanding of and respect for human rights in Australia and ensuring appropriate recognition of human rights issues in legislative and policy development. The bills will establish the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights.
The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights is 10 years old. That's a whole decade of playing a very important role in highlighting the human rights implications of the legislation conceived by the Commonwealth Parliament.
This committee gives a voice to human rights in our legislative process and acts as a method of ensuring the rights of all are protected when bills are introduced to the Parliament. In Australia, we pride ourselves in providing a culture of inclusivity, respect and equality. Through regular conversation with members, ministers and stakeholders, this committee provides a method of enshrining these values in our legislation, whilst promoting and endorsing respect for human rights in Australia.
This committee is such a fundamental part of a human rights framework that can be a part of the check and the balance that we need in our country to ensure that we deliver on our fundamental human rights obligations through the work of the Parliament.
I have to admit that I was rather daunted by the task, because if you look at the 7 international instruments, you could say, well, wait a minute, how do we actually achieve those? But it wasn't necessarily about achieving. What our purpose was to ensure that people understood that they were there, that they were educated about that they considered those things when they were putting together legislation.
The committee is actually an important bridge in bringing international law obligations into Australian law and practice. And so it plays a very important role in encouraging the executive and the legislature to take account of Australia's international legal obligations.
For me, it was a very important role to be able to scrutinise Australia's legislation against the international obligations we have assumed in a broad range of human rights areas. It's particularly important that we demonstrate to the rest of the world in relation to the important human rights obligations that we have accepted, that we in Australia ensure that in our legislation, in our delegated legislation, steps are taken to ensure that we actually meet our obligations.
I think the feature that stands out the most, the feature that is the most important, is the effort that is required and the triumph that is often achieved in ensuring that the Parliament gets to represent a view about our international treaty obligations and whether or not our domestic laws reflect the ambitions of those treaties. It has also demonstrated, I think, the importance of parliamentary views as opposed to partisan views.
I was lucky enough to have a committee that saw that this wasn't about politics, that they could flourish as true parliamentarians in actually doing the work of Parliament. And I think that that's important.
The Human Rights Committee is above politics. Its purpose is to ensure that human rights for all Australians are protected from the legislative impact of government, irrespective of the hue of that government. And the Human Rights Committee ensures that the Parliament is made aware of the impact that legislation will have on the daily lives of Australians.
I think the members of the committee shared a genuine commitment to play our part to reduce the likelihood that the Australian Parliament would pass legislation that was incompatible with human rights.
When I was on the committee, we looked at a range of legislation that impacted refugee rights and also a range of legislation that looked at national security. They were the two areas where the debates were most forceful. And some of those meetings went on for a very long time, and there was not always agreement. But what we did have was that was a dedicated process where these issues were raised. And if it wasn't raised at the Human Rights Committee, where in fact would these issues be raised? Where would ministers, departments and experts have to justify legislation against the various claims about human rights?
The great service that the committee does is to tell Parliament and the public on the record when laws risk violating human rights. But it's those same laws that may well be government policy and have broad public support. At that point, the committee's view is a passive challenge to Australia's willingness to meet its human rights obligations. And whether its view is acted on is a political issue for government and the Parliament.
I think the committee's scrutiny and reporting role remains as important as ever, because at the least it mitigates against the unwitting or ignorant breaches of human rights by the Parliament. And that means it's not possible for those in the Parliament who vote in favour of legislation to say, we didn't know. That then may allow Australian communities in the future, if community standards change or the consequences of that legislation becomes ever more apparent, to then potentially hold decision makers and governments accountable.
Most rights can permissibly be limited. So much of the committee's work is determining whether limits on rights are reasonable, necessary and proportionate. And often this issue of proportionality is key. So the Committee on Advice is looking at whether limits on rights are subject to checks and balances, to safeguards, to oversight, and overall whether the limit on rights is achieving the aim of the legislation in the least rights restrictive way possible.
This structured approach to proportionality has helped other committees in the system, as well as public servants and other submission makers, to be able to articulate their ideas in a structured, consistent and accessible way. This is part of the hidden impact of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. It is developing a culture of rights scrutiny that has been able to transcend just the legislative design that we see move through the Parliament in Canberra, but also the way that governments think about their role and the community thinks about advocacy in a rights space.
One of the other aspects that came very much to my mind was that this form of international law dealing with the treaties that you sign is complex, is difficult. And there is a host of international obligations that are examined in competing treaties where sometimes you've got to rationalise one against another.
Because we found out very quickly that it was not black and white. It was very often competing values, competing rights, and that our job was to really take on board the advice that we received and come up with a recommendation about what was the impact of that legislation, taking into account human rights.
Another important way in which the committee has been able to contribute to greater scrutiny of human rights issues in Australian legislation, and in effect to effect changes, is in its use of the inquiry function. These have provided an important opportunity for the committee to look in a holistic manner at the operation of a particular law or particular laws, and to take into account evidence provided not just by government, but by those whose lives are affected by that legislation.
As well as scrutinising legislation, the Human Rights Committee has an investigative function. It can inquire into any matter relating to human rights once referred by the Attorney-General. To my mind, the Freedom of Speech in Australia inquiry highlighted the crucial role of the Human Rights Committee to be apolitical in upholding human rights in Australia.
And one of the pieces of work that we did was a public inquiry into the legislation that sat before the House on religious discrimination. And I was very pleased with the information that we drew out, the number of submissions that were made, and it's part of hearing our democracy at work to consider the human rights for all.
At the end of the day, when we reflect after 10 years, it's not only the work of the committee that we reflect upon, but we reflect upon that work and the way in which it's influenced the way the whole Australian public service looks upon its obligations of a human rights nature, and also we look upon how that's reflected in an understanding of the Australian public.
I see the first 10 years as a bedding down period when governments have been getting used to being scrutinised and reported on. The committee now, I think, has a solid foundation for its work to be better understood and appreciated, as it continues to do what it can to ensure that Australia meets its human rights obligations in its legislation.
Congratulations on 10 years. I look forward to watching the progress and the evolution of the committee in the next 10 years. Our parliamentary system is a dynamic one. Committee processes and committee customs don't stand still. They are not static. They move with the times. And I look forward to watching very, very closely to see how the Joint Human Rights Committee starts to evolve over time.
For the last 10 years, the Human Rights Committee has served as a really important instrument for our Parliament to examine and uphold Australia's obligations under the many human rights treaties that we've signed and the legislation that we have implemented here in Australia. And I'm really looking forward to, in this Parliament, continuing that tradition of ensuring that Australia remains committed to our human rights obligations, while also examining the legislation that the government is going to bring forward and some other ideas about how we can bolster and strengthen human rights in Australia. It's important work. We've got a great committee and I'm looking forward to it.
To learn more about the committee, visit aph.gov.au/joint_human rights.
Thank you so much to everyone who contributed to the video and to the Secretariat for putting it together. And now for our panel discussion, and I'm really delighted to welcome our distinguished panellists today. And I thought I might start by asking about the very beginning. So perhaps particularly Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Wyatt, how did you go about setting up the committee, and what were the challenges and the achievements in those early years?
Oh, an easy question, eh? All right, well, we had a blank canvas because in the Australian context this hadn't been done before. So from the get-go we decided that one of the positive things would be to speak to stakeholders to see what their expectations were. We took the opportunity to speak to the British committee because they'd been going for a while, whilst the way that they'd been set up was different. The things that they'd learnt were important. And I was just reflecting to Ken that when we spoke to the stakeholders, it was reassuring because, as I said in the video, I found on the face of it that this was a daunting task. The amount of legislation and legislative instruments that are created, how did we tackle them? How did we achieve those things that were set out in the 7 international agreements? And when we sat down with the Human Rights Commission, and they said, well, we realise it's a big task, but you can walk the walk with us, and as long as you're achieving the task of investigating, reflecting upon how the legislation compared to the obligations, to do the education of the public service and the wider community that was required. So we were very lucky that the people that we spoke to were reassuring. I was looking at my notes of meetings, and we spoke to George Williams, and I've circled the word triage because that was pretty important. Suddenly I thought, oh, well, we can achieve it, We have a look at this pile and we decide, well, they have no consequence, they don't look at them. These have little consequence. Concentrate all your resources on these ones. And that was really very important. But The one thing was we had a legislative base, we had a human rights template through the obligations that we were to compare to, and that this was a parliamentary committee and there was no need for the politics. The politics had been done through the consultation, the legislation, and it was for the committee to do its role. We could leave the committee room and then do the politics, but within the committee, and I was very lucky, Ken had a bit of a background in this area and understood that he needed to do this through a parliamentary lens. And digressing a little, that was what pleased me about the video. I mean, each of the contributors that I know about acting as a parliamentarian, and they knew that this was a fora where they had to act as a parliamentarian. But Ken will do a better answer than that.
No, Harry's approach was great because we looked at who were the stakeholders that we needed to engage with, because we needed to ascertain their views in respect to what was expected of us by the Parliament. Because you can do it as a parliamentary committee, but if you don't bring stakeholders with you, then you can have that divergence of opinion on issues that you have to grapple with. The other was the human factor, not only in this place, but also externally and the public sector, because you're changing a mindset of practice that had been entrenched since Federation to suddenly asking everybody to consider 7 international conventions and then use those as a benchmark to run across your thinking in terms of legislation and whether you're impacting. And whilst we had a blank canvas, it gave us the opportunity of really bringing together a team of parliamentary colleagues in a very united way of setting aside bipartisanship and focusing on what was required under the legislation. Harry and I both ended up in London at a different point, but we had the opportunity of talking to the secretariat of their structures and gaining an insight into the processes, because one of the issues is it's great when you implement new reforms. The issue is sustaining it and keeping the levels of interest at that higher level when you ascertain whether legislation is breaching a human right. I suspect after 10 years that in the public sector, that has probably diminished from that high level, high watermark. Because normally when you implement a new program, you have people for about 5 years with any bureaucracy and they start to churn over. And there is sometimes a need to go back and revisit the training of officers so that you retain the integrity of what the Act intended. The only disappointment I had at the time was UNDRIP wasn't in there to consider Indigenous issues in the context of the deliberations, although there are many facets in those conventions that do go to the protection of rights for Indigenous and called groups. So the work that we did from a blank canvas, I think we did exceptionally well, because every time we came out of our committees, when Harry and I were there together, there was strong consensus. And as Harry mentioned, the political debates happened in the chamber, not around the work that we did, and people did pick up on human rights.
Jackie, the one thing that I haven't mentioned was that, of course, we realised pretty quick that we needed a legal advisor, and there hadn't been a legal advisor to a parliamentary committee on human rights beforehand, so we had to write the script for what we thought that type of person should be like. And it was good to see Andrew on the video, because I think that he did a sterling job and helped us then frame the way that we would go about our business. And I'm sure that those that have continued as legal advisors have been fine people too.
Well, thank you. And I have to say I'm very grateful to Andrew as well, because I feel his job must have been daunting along the lines of yours as well, and he set out a really clear framework that the rest of us have been able to follow. So I just want to pick up on Mr. Wyatt, your point about the energy in the committee and that being there for a while and possibly changing. And Mr. Perrett, could I ask you perhaps your thoughts on whether the committee's changed over time, what changes you've seen?
It has, and I think this paper captures much of the element of it, but I think Harry and Ken hit the nail on the head. And can I say it's great to have 3 House of Reps people speaking on behalf of a Senate committee. I think this should be continued. So, but in terms of Senate rules, but look, the key thing that Ken and Harry said is that the flourishing as true parliamentarians, the tone is set by the chair. So that I don't think I was there for Chair Ruddock, but so I've experienced a range of chairs, and the chair and deputy chair do set the tone, and if they are focused on dragging the politics from outside the committee into that meeting, it doesn't work. And I've said it before, but I think that British model of having is Josh Burns listening to this? Of having a chair from the opposition is actually beneficial, because it can be career limiting when you come out and say to the government of the day, Harry, you remember? Sending people to Manus Island has implications. But you've got to be able to speak fearlessly to the executive, to the parliament, but to the executive especially, because when you walk outside that committee, there are wolves out there, and it's tough. So the chair and the deputy chair do set a tone inside that room, and I have seen it not function. Most of the chairs have been wonderful. But I've seen it not function well.
And Graham, you're right in terms, I used to feel for Harry because he'd leave the meeting knowing that the committee had identified potential breaches of legislation. He had to deliver the message back to his ministers, and given he was the first chair, that would have been hard because you're changing a mindset and a practice, as I alluded to earlier. And he did that with great grace and aplomb because the work that we did then became entrenched, and people started to accept the way in which that committee operated.
Yeah, you educated departments. Yeah, that's the beauty of it. Yeah, those departments started to change, and it was. But going into those headwinds early would not have been easy, Harry.
The reflection that I make was, well, I was to the end of my career, and I knew that I was leaving, but. Again, it was to put that parliamentary lens on something I thought was important. And if I step back a little bit, I think that parliamentary committees are the hope of a modern parliament. And this is one that is important, but in the wider sense it's important. And digressing a little further about, I'm not looking for anything in the diplomatic field, but my diplomacy says that I should say something about the Senate. Now, the Senate has a long tradition of scrutiny of bills, and in a way this was one of the important functions. And I think that we ended up being very fortunate, and this is no reflection on the Department of the House of Representatives, that the Senate was the Secretariat, because they had experience through other things that they were doing, and they knew how to do it. And during my speakership, I always talked about that it was a 2 houses, 1 parliament. And the fact that the 2 houses might approach things different didn't matter. It was the totality that the parliament did. And it was very educative for us from the reps to have a different way of looking at things. But not that really the human rights area is any area to make jokes and speak lightly about. It did get to a point where I did say as an aside, if I disappear, I might be in the bottom of Lake Burley Griffin with cement shoes, because what we're about to report won't go down too well. But that was the importance of the role. I mean, if the message was critical with a capital C, it had to be given, and a lot of what was said in the video is important. It may not have changed anything then and there, but it certainly, we hope, had the purpose of having those that were formulating policy thinking more deeply about what they had to do, thinking more deeply about the compatibility of their proposals in a legislative form. So, yeah, it was easier for me people claim I had some status as a former speaker to get away with it, but I'm not too sure. I just encourage Josh to give it a go. He's sort of on the start of his journey, but you know, I think that it's important just to do the job that's given.
So I find that really interesting that all three of you have really picked up on this idea of it being a technical scrutiny committee and being non-partisan. And I think it's very interesting because there are obviously the other two scrutiny committees, Scrutiny of Bills and Delegated Legislation, but it seems their chairs probably wouldn't attract the concern about being found at the bottom of the lake in quite the same way, I think, as a Human Rights Committee, probably because of the nature of the subject matter. And I suppose, following on from that, do you think there's some protection then that comes from the idea of being a scrutiny committee? Does it help to distance you from some of the politics, that you can be one person in the committee room and another person on the floor of the Parliament in some senses?
It does, because I'd been on a number of House of Reps committees, but this one was extremely challenging initially because of the scrutiny process. And that changes the way in which you then engage with your colleagues. And that's why I served in an incredible period in that first couple of years with Harry, because we took the advice that was given about the process. And there were two papers written. One was the guidance note, Godin's note 1 for expectations of statements of compatibility. And then the offence provisions and penalties in human rights. And that gave us a very solid foundation for the way in which we deliberated. But I think the other thing that's important about this committee, there was also a human element to it, that the human compassion was considered by members of the committee. And we would have disagreement, we'd have some really good debates around some of the legislation that was before us. But when we walked out that room, we walked out with a position that Harry would then table the reports from. And that remained constant. It wasn't until later on that we saw the first paper of dissension written. But generally it was around the Senate process that we consolidated the foundations of that committee. Because when you take a blank canvas and you've got to build something, it's challenging. And Harry and I often used to meet. He'd see me in the corridor and say, come around here a minute, and we'd sit just outside the House of Reps and talk about an issue that we were grappling with. And then we'd go away and continue the work of the committee. But we achieved some great outcomes and we set a great trend for the future.
I won't go into the detail of it, but I remember on one occasion, because we did do private members' bills, that there was a private members' bill proposed by a shadow minister. And maybe that shadow minister might have gone and contacted the deputy chair of the committee and said, well, you know, you'll look after me in the committee. And Ken reported that he said, no, you'll get treated like the government's legislation gets treated, and you might hear bad news because the government minister's bringing bad news. So yeah. I was reassured by that we were going to have that consistency. And I won't name who the shadow minister was.
Nor will I.
Everyone's intrigued now. So following on from that idea of, you know, being technical in the committee and then the politics takes place outside, I wonder if I could ask more broadly, do you feel it's impacted your work as parliamentarians outside the committee framework? Has it changed how you look at legislation generally?
It certainly has for me. When I think of those first couple of meetings, you know, way back last century almost, it seems. It has. And I, as the paper touches on, I think public servants, governments, stakeholders are more aware of it now, and it shapes so many, you know, things happened in the 46th Parliament that wouldn't have happened in the 43rd Parliament, what is it, 44th? 43rd? Yeah, because it's like this, sorry, we hadn't realised that, whereas back then it was, why are they talking to me about human rights? You know, we're in health, we don't make human rights decisions. Well, yes, you do. And now they know that they do. You know, we're almost there with Treasury, aren't we, Nita? Yeah, I mean, people are becoming more aware of, and so it definitely has informed how I approach things in the caucus room, looking at committee decisions. And there's so many more voices when you look at the Nick McKims, the Penny, the Claire Moore, then there's so many more voices to be able to echo those concerns.
And they keep those voices going outside of here as well. Once you're immersed in the human rights areas, it doesn't matter whether it's external to this place or not, if you're at the Human Rights Commission or an Equal Opportunity Commission, then you cast a lens on people in a very different way as opposed to when you're not immersed in it. And I think we've had an impact, but there are still many members who would not be across the detail of conventions. But nevertheless, based on the committee's reports, they're conscious of areas that need consideration. Because once the legislation goes into place, the only way you can undo it is for a future parliament or through a High Court challenge or a court challenge that has implications. And then we don't want to go down those pathways. What we want to do is get it right in here first so that we don't waste resources on the legal arguments that can be costly and lengthy. Because if we get it right in here, then it means that the lives of Australians are much better for the decisions of Parliament.
I, of course, had moved on and really don't sort of have that background of having to worry about legislation, but one would understand that over the last few years with global events that have descended upon us, people in the streets chanting human rights, this, that and the other thing, that I sort of focused on sort of the background that the work of this committee gave me. Yeah. And one of the things that always comes out is proportionality. The fact that you really have to scrutinise and say, all right, if we're going to impinge upon something, how far do we do it to get another outcome? And sadly, in the public debate about everything that people thought had to happen during the pandemic, we haven't had that debate about extent, about proportionality. It's as if, and Claire Moore talks about the grey, you know, everybody thinks it's black and white. Well, no, it's not, and place more importance on one aspect of behaviour than other aspects of behaviour. And it is complex. So I was pleased to read in the paper that, you know, the work that was done by virtual meeting about COVID-related legislation, and I hope that we continue to have the debate. I see that there are academic papers and books being written about this period, because it will give a set example where you can sit down and say, no, this was complex. There was a whole range of obligations that were encroached upon, but the balance had to be set. So in my mind, I thought, oh, well, I got something out of it. I sort of, you know, it was clear to me about the things that were important to be analysed and to decided on. So hopefully that can continue on. And I mean, we look at the national consultation back in 2009 under Father Brennan's chair. All those things were discussed then, the lack of awareness. He discussed the politics of what was going on, but then, you know, into the framework was this mechanism, and the committee's mechanism is to look at all legislation before the Parliament. It's one central aspect, but it's important work.
Yes, and in that COVID context, I think it was really important because for some of that period, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights was the only committee that could look at those non-disallowable instruments. So it was looking at these critically important instruments for everybody that otherwise wouldn't have been subject to scrutiny.
And under the banner of I'm saving lives, insert action. You know, I mean, we saw incredible disregard for human rights because people were trying to keep people alive. But, you know, there was also an opportunity, I thought, for other people to do things that they could put under the, you know, the health umbrella that were dodgy as, I thought, along the way. So,
is that a technical term, is it?
Well, you don't have to go far to see people who will trample on rights. You know, you go down to your local bowls club, someone will try and, you know, people have that capacity to be bad or to listen to their lesser angels. So that's why we need the checks and balances and educating people, and people will drift into being tyrants pretty easily.
And that's where you've got to keep the balance, because you're right. I had the task of the spread of COVID in Aboriginal communities and imposing some very stringent measures preventing people leaving their communities. But we knew that if it broke out in an Aboriginal community, with the lack of resources available in respiratory and hospital treatments, we had the potential to lose lives. So weighing that up, and having sat on this committee, I gave thought to it, but in the end just thought, no, and it's a point you make, you have to save lives. But the moment the community wanted it lifted and we had discussions, we lifted it. I didn't keep it in place. So you've got to keep this balance. And that's always challenging in a crisis or an emergency, because I think governments will face emergencies in the future where they will trample on rights as people see them. That's why we had the anti-vaxxers being vaccinated. They would argue their rights had been eroded by the stance of governments. But on the other hand, you've got to think about the greater good for the broader population and what decision you make as a government to protect. But as long as you don't become tyrannical in that process, you've got to weigh up all of the balances of what is fair and reasonable and what you can inflict and remove at a given point in time, and honour that lifting of restrictions.
So that's very interesting, because that's suggesting this idea of proportionality that comes from human rights law is a useful framework just from a policy perspective generally for evaluating legislation and proposals. So can I ask you a general question now? Each of you, what do you think have been the highlights or the big achievement of the committee over your time? Sorry.
I'll
Mr.
go,
Perrett?
because I think the inquiries, the 18C, the religious, they've what was the
restraints in aged care.
Yeah, the restraint. Yeah, there's a classic one that it was just it could have gone through and you wouldn't even see. It'd be like, oh well, and that evidence was chilling. Incredibly. So I think those have been the highlights for me. And the other highlight, which I'll direct at the Secretariat, is looking back and saying we have moved the nation on a bit. Lot more work to do if we have all those justice and fairness down the bowls club. But those inquiries have been it for me. They've been, and some of the committee has done some of its best work, I think, in those inquiries. So I know it gives the Secretariat heart attacks, but because they're incredibly hard-working small group of people. But that's it for me.
So the highlight for me was the Secretariat and Professor Andrew Bird's coming on board. Because even though I'd had a background of 10 years on the WA Equal Opportunity Commission and being involved in Indigenous affairs where we continually strived for better human rights outcomes, having the legal opinion gave a degree of certainty in the direction that we needed to consider with legislation, but equally in the establishment of the way in which we wanted to work as a committee. And their input, both legal advisors, whilst we might debate issues with them, were always strong on the proportionality that we had to consider. And that was important because as a layperson on a parliamentary committee, you can have a passionate view about an area and argue with some rigour for it. But when you have somebody that just pulls you up and says, all right, let's consider proportionality in what you're arguing. And I think the second highlight was the incredible camaraderie of the membership that we had when Harry and I were there. And of course, achievement.
We're going to do lowlights later.
So no, I find it It's a bit hard to talk about the first 18 months, but I think that the most important part about that first 18 months was that the committee, the secretariat, the legal advisor, with the goodwill of a whole host of stakeholders, were able to put in place a methodology for the committee that's lasted for the decade. And so my reflection, 10 years on, is one of pride that we're able to do that. And in what... Look, I have a science degree from ANU. What do I know about the law? But as a parliamentarian, you learn about things. And one of the great privileges as a parliamentarian, you get exposed to a whole host of things that you have to make a lot easier than they are at first glance. And this was yet another example. And Jackie uses the word, technical. Well, that was one of the things that the hurdle we had to get over, because when we convey things to give it the most educational purpose, we have to break it down into a language that's understood. And in preparing for today, I was reminded about all the jargon we got into and the anagrams and everything. And I've got this sheet here where I was welcoming Professor Gillian Briggs as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission to appear before us, and, had the cheek to ask her name and the capacity in which she appeared. But at the bottom I've written ICESCR, which of course is the economic, social and... that's cultural rights. And I'm thinking, well, did we really lapse into talking about the international treaties in that way rather than explaining them better? I hope we didn't, because we set out to make sure that we did it in an understandable way. So if we're going to be able to win the arguments about people not overly trampling rights, you've got to do it not necessarily in the legalese language. And to the extent that we were able to do that, I hope it was an achievement. But, I think that looking back on the work for the 10 years, you all understand that and you're continuing it on.
Yes, and I think that is such an achievement of the committee, because as an international law teacher, I can acknowledge that international law is full of jargon and not in any way accessible to the average person. And I think that's something really important that the committee has done in translating these international treaties that Australia is party to into something that explains its impact on the lives of everyday Australians. It's really important, and in a language that makes sense to them. So we've talked about achievements. My final question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are many. What do you see, or what would you like to see in the committee's future in the next 10 years, perhaps? Any grand plans, visions?
I'll briefly, because sort of outside of you. In that initial period, we toyed about whether we should be suggesting amendments or not. And the thing was that we were hardly crawling, let alone walking, let alone running. And I noticed that there is a thirst now for at least suggesting amendments that might rectify any, whether unwittingly or just the way it happened. And that'd be terrific, because I just think that is a reflection upon the growing maturity of the committee. So if that's able to happen more often. Again, these are things that will have to be taken on board, and it's no skin off the nose of the committee if they're ignored. I just have a belief that sometimes you throw that out there, and mightn't be in this instance, but down the track they'll say, we better conform a little bit better than we have been.
Yes, and if there's a concrete suggestion, it makes it that much easier to take up.
We were just not in a position to do that. Like, we had to get our training wheels off because we could do that. But I'm happy to see that that's the possibilities going forward to be more into that.
Why?
Look, under section 3, which is the definitions, whether the committee or legislation in the future becomes cognizant of the voice, given that you may do an amendment, Graham, that picks up the notion of the voice being able to provide advice to the committee on those matters that are very particular to Indigenous affairs.
I like it.
The other one would be, or I'm going to use acronym UNDRIP being considered in that context as well, although there are many complications within that convention. The other is domestic rights that we have enshrined in Australian law. Has never been considered by the committee. We look at the international rights, but not those of domestic rights, which has its own complexities. But then again, how often is legislation not encumbering those domestic rights that we take for granted in this nation, so that we don't get the bowling club scenario you're talking about?
And I'd like us to engage with our region more, into the parliaments in our region, in Asia Pacific. I think we should be engaging with them more in terms of, so that we can all speak human rights. That's a language we should all be speaking together. I know it's in terms of extending the power of this sovereign state, but it would make our part of the world a better place if we had parliamentarians and parliaments and then executives who understood human rights. And I think that's what we should be looking to do over the next 10 years as we are more mature. That's, I think, where I don't know where that budget would come from, but that is something that I think we should look at doing. I've just given Anita a heart attack, but whatever that role is in terms of engaging with Zoom, Skype, whatever, but that's something we should look at. It's time.
I really should have left more time for that last question, because there's so much to unpack there and so many amazing visions for the future of the committee. But I'd like to leave some time for questions for our audience. So does anyone have questions? And I'm instructed that in the interest of COVID safety to please use the microphone.
Thank you very much. I had a question that went to the educative function that all of you have very clearly identified, and the extent that it somewhat clashes in terms of public education with the desire to take the politics out of the scrutiny role. In my observation, that's tended to lead to an avoidance of media around perhaps scrutiny reports that bring out contentious political issues, and that avoidance of media may impede the public's engagement with and understanding of the scrutiny work of the committee. I wonder how you see that tension perhaps resolving more in favour of public education.
I didn't think we did avoid media.
Sorry, I wasn't going to rail against the media, but I will now. First of all, I'll step back. I wish the media would take more interest in the parliamentary committee system, whatever parliamentary committee it is. They only take an interest in a committee if there's bombs bursting in air in the committee room. My jokes about my fate indicate the seriousness that I think was our criticism of legislation. I would have welcomed some media interest. And I'm critical that there's not media interest, because I could have justified that we didn't take it any further. Somebody used the word, a sort of passive reporting and stuff like that. Well, that's what it was. But the thing was that we were laying down a marker about issues that might have been to do with specific legislation that was being proposed. And if we could get more than social media type standard of scrutiny by media about what we were doing, it would have been terrific. And then flow on to the public education. There is a slight disjunct that there needs to be a wider public education that goes outside of just the parliamentary legislation and things like that. But we always saw that our work was part of the public education. It's a slightly different matter, but gee whiz, if the media took an interest, hallelujah.
But they do run on a lot of reports. You see the reports, words coming back either through other parliamentarians or through the media. I mean, the paper gives many examples. So, and you know, I don't think there's too many politicians that are shy when it comes to the media. So, we won't reveal what goes on in the committee, you know, as a rule.
Yeah, well, I should.
Yeah, because if you want to be a parliamentarian, you must let the committee process have its proper rules so people can speak freely. And I think we've been a pretty good committee in terms. I can think of one or two leaks in my time that, but mostly it's been you speak bluntly, freely, sort of like a cabinet process. I mean, a traditional cabinet process, not. What?
No. Yes.
Chris Klugman, Civil Liberties Australia. Thank you for that rundown for the last 10 years. You talked about changing cultures, and I think that's an incredibly important aspect. But Harry Jenkins mentioned the 2009 Frank Brennan inquiry. The main recommendation for that, in fact, was for a Human Rights Act. You'll remember that it read that Australia adopt a Human Rights Act to be implemented for further strengthening the protection of compatibility statements and the Joint Committee and other human rights developments over the past dozen years. So isn't it time that we adopted that recommendation from that wide consultation all those years ago, that Australia adopts a Federal Human Rights Act? Thanks.
Do you want us to respond as political parties or as a collective? Because we're here as a representative of a political party, you know, so I go through a political process. That's a recommendation that has merit and parties consider it, but I'll leave it to Ken to speak for the Liberal Party.
You speak for Ken.
When this was first introduced, as with all reports, and particularly reports like this one that had a lot of merit in establishing a process for this Parliament, what governments do is they look at what is feasible and obtainable within a period of time to give credence to the work that is important. And the establishment of the committee was a priority of the Rudd government of the day. Other elements of the report can be and are often revisited at another period. And I suspect that the establishment of the committee was the priority, with the intent that you'd have the scrutinisation of bills. At some point, any government can come back and revisit those reports, as we do at different times in the history of this place. And it'll be done in the context of where the nation is headed to, where it's at, and its maturity to accept what is necessary and needed for the greater good of all and the greater good of the nation. And I would hope at some stage there is a government that does come back and revisit that report, because the reports don't disappear. They're often brought forward, as you've done today, and in reminding people that there's some unfinished business.
And there's a number of states and territories now that have moved on compared to when that were reported. Yeah. So, common sense and fear will be less of a problem down the track, one would think.
Chris, thanks for the question, because in preparation for today, in reviewing that report, in the back of my mind I thought, it's time to revisit. And I might add, just going back a little bit in time when I was the Speaker, perhaps you'd enjoy this committee looking upon the actions of the presiding officers around this place and whether we conform to our human rights obligations. I just share that with you, that I remember discussions that we had about around this place.
Okay, one last question, I think.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm aware we don't have much time. Mine's a fairly short question. Thank you for the discussion. My name's Fleur. I'm Director of Legislation and Records in the Table Office in the House of Reps. I was just interested in the, and it came up briefly in the discussion about the scrutiny of delegated legislation. And I understand the Senate Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Delegated Legislation now considers instruments that are exempt from disallowance where previously it didn't. I might be wrong on that. Has the Human Rights Committee always considered those instruments? Does it consider those instruments which are exempt? Has it always done so? Has that always been the case? And what are the options for those instruments where there are concerns about instruments which might affect rights and obligations and they're exempt from disallowance? Thanks.
So we were hitting 3%, wasn't we?
We were reporting on instruments generally, but I think your question is, has the committee always considered instruments exempt from disallowance? And my understanding is that it has.
My understanding is we always did, and that was part of the load of triaging all the many instruments. And again, the opinion of the committee was an opinion based on what the instrument was doing against the obligations. So whether it was disallowable or not didn't really faze us. I mean, if it was disallowable, it put the time pressure on us, which we were conscious of.
But we had mechanism, and there's a few examples in the paper in terms of committee members stepping up once it was highlighted, and I think the McKim and Dodson examples in the paper show that we can do it, but ministers can send a lot of stuff through, can't they? I mean, that can really have significant implications for a group of people. So, but it was pretty. That COVID time, it was like a barrage of information. So you've got to keep scrutinising. So.
Even when, obviously, in the case of an exempt instrument, it's not going to be possible for Parliament to disallow it. But I suppose you hope you're contributing to that discussion and parliamentary oversight in a broader sense in that context. Yeah. Okay, we've gone a little bit over time, so just a huge thank you to our distinguished panellists and to everyone for coming today, and the amazing Secretariat for organising everything. And happy birthday, PJCHR.
Speaking of birthdays, someone was 70 yesterday, so happy birthday to Harry Jenkins as well.
So just quickly to wrap up, thank you again to all of our panellists and moderator as well. A recording of the lecture and information about future lectures will be available on the Senate Lecture Series website. The paper relating to the lecture will also be made available on the website. The next event for this series is on Friday the 23rd of September. Will be presented by Mr Romilly Mokak, Commissioner of the Productivity Commission. If you've not done so already, I encourage you to sign up to the Senate Lecture email subscriber list for further information about the Senate Lecture series. Subscription sign-up is at the exit table. And if you'd like to keep up to date with the activities of the Human Rights Committee, please subscribe to the committee's mailing list. You can do so by either emailing the Secretariat or also adding your details to the sign-up sheet at the exit table. That concludes our formal proceedings, so thank you very much.
That was a fabulous discussion. Thank you all so much.
Well done, Anita.